So I've spent a lot of years traveling around the country and around the world talking to students about sex and God's plan for sex. And God created sex, it's amazing, but he put a boundary around it. And that boundary is marriage, not a fuzzy feeling, not we like each other, marriage. And the reason for that boundary is to protect us physically from all the STIs and unplanned pregnancies and all of the pain that can come with sex outside of that boundary, but also emotionally and spiritually, and to protect our marriages. I think one of the things that is fascinating when you speak to students, especially as we get into the college age, it's like somewhere we thought we could just sleep around, we didn't need the boundary, and someday we would get married, we'd be in love, we'd say some magic words, and now we would be able to control what we never controlled before. Sexual discipline is something you have to practice not just before marriage, but after marriage. It is a forever thing. It's not just, oh, these teenagers or these students have to practice sexual discipline, but we all can do whatever we want. And it's important because what we found is that statistically, we have so much divorce, marriage is failing, so much infidelity and unfaithfulness. But the reality is, if two people get married as virgins, both of them have already had the sexual discipline throughout their growing up years and certainly during their dating, that there is a 2% divorce rate for couples who marry as virgins. And so what that tells us, the most important thing it tells us, is that the same discipline that you put in place prior to making that commitment to marriage is the discipline that you use to maintain that same integrity while you're married. One of my favorite pastors said, every couple that comes to my church to get married sits down with me. First thing he asks them is, are you having sex or are you living together? If they say yes to either of those things, this very wise pastor looks at them and says, you've both told each other by your behavior that you're perfectly comfortable having sex with someone you're not married to. Weddings don't fix that, right? So the important thing to understand is that your boundary can't be whoever you like at any given moment. Your boundary has to be marriage, covenant, that decision where one man, one woman make a commitment to each other for life. God loves you and God loves me, and God's law is not about wrecking our fun and ruining our weekend. It's about giving us the best. Jesus came to give us life, but God took a colossal risk at the beginning of time, and if I were God, I would not have done it, which is why I'm not. God, for some reason, decided to let you choose. Give us a choice, knowing that we would all at one point shake our fists in his face and tell him we don't need him, we don't need his rules. God doesn't need to tell me how to live my life, and what would follow would be sin, disease, pain, and death. Even though he knew that, he still let you choose. So God's boundary is not about ruining your fun. God's boundary is about protecting you. And it's really important that we understand when we choose to not abide by his boundary, there is always a consequence. The wages of sin is death, not occasionally, every single time. And so we live in a culture that believes we can sin safely. You can't sin safely. The end result of sin will always be, at some level, death. Obviously, when we talk to students about sex and the consequences of sex, the biggest fear that most young people have when it comes to decisions about sex is pregnancy. They're afraid that they might be pregnant. And it's so important to understand pregnancy is not a disease. It's survivable. You can live through that. That is not the worst thing that could happen. I'll have a girl come into my pregnancy clinic for a pregnancy test. She's scared, waiting for the results of that test. I walk in and say, hey, your test is negative. She gets this look of relief over her face, like, I'm off the hook, thank goodness, I'm not pregnant, let me out of your clinic. Wait a minute, have you been tested for syphilis, gonorrhea, herpes, chlamydia, trichomonas, vulvodynia, arthritis, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HPV, HIV? Have you been tested for these things? And typically they're like, me? Why would I need to be tested for that? Our students still don't understand the tremendous risk right now of STI infection. Every year, the Centers for Disease Control releases their surveillance reports and tells us what's going on across the United States when it comes to STDs. Last year, we had the highest STD rate we have ever had in the history of recording this. We had 22.5 million new infections in the U.S. with sexually transmitted diseases, and close to 60% of that number are people between the ages of 15 and 24. So we know where the problem is. It's there. In the 1950s, we had 5 sexually transmitted infections we knew about and were treating. Today, we have over 30% of them absolutely incurable. And the problem that especially our young people don't understand is that of these major 30 STDs we're dealing with, 26 of them primarily damage women. The other 4 damage both. And this damage that's long-term is can be primarily fertility, future fertility. We've had an increase of infertility among women in our country, upwards of 400% just in the last decade. Because the reality is we've got so many young people who are making not the best choices when it comes to sex. They're either they know they've been infected with an STD like chlamydia, or some of them were infected and never knew it. All of a sudden they get married and think, oh, well, I want to be a mom now. You know, I found the right guy, I finished college. She tries to get pregnant, she can't, goes running to a doctor, and he says, my goodness, sweetheart, you've got all this scar tissue in your fallopian tubes, your ovaries, your uterus. You have pelvic inflammatory disease. You had chlamydia when you were a teenager or a college student. It's like, what? I had a sexually transmitted infection. I didn't even know. It's too late now. It's too late. And it's so important before young people make decisions about what they're going to do that they fully understand what the consequence of that could be, not to their immediate physical self, but to their ability to have children someday and future problems. And so it is an epidemic of sexually transmitted infection in our country, and your risk of infection is directly related to your number of partners. Has nothing to do with whether you used a condom or a vaccine or all of these things that supposedly reduce your risk. Your risk of infection is directly related to your number of partners. And so, you know, that's the big question. That's what I've said to every kid. Before you get married, both of you have to be really honest about every place you've ever been, because you're not just having sex with that person, you're with everyone they've been with and everyone they've been with and everyone they've been with for at least a decade. 55 years ago, a young 15-year-old became pregnant. She had a lot of difficult choices to make, maybe more so than some teen girls, because she was raped. But this 15-year-old girl chose to give her child life and to place that child with an adoptive family, and that child was me. My biological father is a rapist. I don't even know my ethnicity, but I am still a human being, and I still have value, and my life isn't worth less than yours just because of the way I was conceived. And I did not deserve the death penalty because of the crime of my biological father. And I've listened to the rhetoric my whole life. Listen to people say, well, every child should be wanted and planned. I've heard this said in the church. Well, I wouldn't have an abortion. That's horrible. I wouldn't kill my child. But if it were rape, you're a mistake, Pam. I don't believe that. I believe that every child is wanted by someone. And I believe that God, in His mercy, had a plan for me. And I've not met my birth mother. I've been praying for her since I was 4. I found out from my social worker that my mother was not only raped at 15, but she was in foster care at the time of my conception. So just imagine, had I been born in 1975 instead of 1965, I probably would have been killed by the state. But I've always said, someday I hope to get to meet this brave woman. She's my hero, and wrap my arms around her and tell her that I love her, because she loved me enough to give me my life. And then she loved me enough to give me the next most special gift I was ever given, and that's my family. I'm the oldest of 8 children, 7 of us adopted, every color of the rainbow in my family. We're the United Nations by ourselves. And I know that my amazing family was a gift from a very scared 15-year-old girl. What my biological mother needed in her horrible, dark time, having gone through the horror of being sexually violated and raped, what she needed was not violence added to violence. Having me ripped from her womb and dismembered would have only damaged her further. It would have killed me. It would have further damaged her. Who are you helping? You're helping the rapist. When you advocate abortion in the case of rape or incest, you are not helping the baby involved. You're not helping the mother. You're helping the perpetrator, and you're allowing that perpetrator to continue to perpetrate other victims because it's all been pushed under the rug. I know that what my birth mother needed was someone to love her, to walk alongside her, to be there for her, to bring hope to her. And that's why I have spent my life walking alongside women in crisis pregnancies and saying, we can help you. Whatever you need, emotionally, physically, spiritually, we are going to be here for you through this crisis and beyond.